Hey guys, Taki here. I've been playing on my Steam Deck non-stop since I got it, and I've tried to answer as many questions as I could along the way, but there's one question that I couldn't answer until today, and that is how the more expensive Steam Deck with the etched glass compares to the glossy screen OLED Steam Deck. In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into this topic to hopefully put this entire thing to rest. Before we open this up and start getting into the meat of this video, in the interest of full transparency, Valve sent this deck to me. I reached out to them to ask if they could help ship a deck to me if I bought it on the official website because I live in a country where you can't get this, and they just replied saying that they would send one to me. They did not need to do that, and that is extremely generous of them. And there we have it, the glossy OLED Steam Deck. I've spent a lot of time with my etched glass OLED Steam Deck, so if there is a big difference here, I should definitely be able to find it. After finishing up that update process, this is what the deck looks like. If we head over to system settings, you can see that we're on 3.5.5. I think 3.5.6 is also out right now, but that is on the beta channel. This is the newest version for the stable channel. At this point, I could go through and set up this deck like I normally would, but there is a faster method that I want to take advantage of for this video. We're going to start off by turning off the Steam Deck. Then I'm going to put this in the case that it came with, and I'm going to take off this back shell. The main difference between this deck and the original is that they now use Torx screws. It's not as convenient as the original, but you will need to use a T7 bit to open this up. On my 1TB OLED deck, these screws felt a bit tighter than they do here. These ones aren't giving me any issues. With the back screws all off, we can now move over to taking off the back shell with a prying tool. With that entire back shell off, now we can start working on the SSD. The first thing that I'm going to do is remove the battery by pulling out this tab, and then I'm going to take off this shield. Just like the back shell, this also uses Torx screws. This is not completely necessary, but I'm also going to remove this ribbon cable over here on the left side. And I'm also going to take out this speaker connector. Now we have access to the SSD, and this also uses a Torx screw. In case anyone was wondering, here's a close-up look of the 512GB SSD. At this point, you have two different paths you can take depending on your situation. If you already own a Steam Deck, you can take out the drive from that deck and put it into this one, and as long as it's been updated to the latest version, it should work with no problem. For example, here's the 512GB SSD from my Gundam deck, and it has already been updated to 3.5.5 or 3.5.6. This is not the option that I'm going to go with, but I just want to demonstrate how easy this is. I can put my Gundam SSD into this deck and then turn it on, and then I can put my new SSD into my Gundam deck and I can keep it as is, or I could resell it with that new SSD in. With that drive installed, this should just boot up without any issues. And as you can see, everything works just fine. If I go into the system settings to see the version, you can see this is on 3.5.6, and that's because this deck was on the beta channel. Now this drive swap is the process that I would take if I was planning on selling my old original Steam Deck with the 512GB card that came with this OLED model. But there's another path that you can take, and that's what I plan on doing in this video. I'm going to take that SSD from my Gundam deck and I'm going to clone it so that way I can have two decks running the exact same software. For this process, you're going to want to have access to an M.2 to USB adapter. I have three different kinds here. These are usually pretty cheap, and either one of these can get the job done. When it comes to drive cloning, there are a few different ways you can go about doing this, including doing the entire process on the deck itself. I'm going to go with Windows, and I'm going to use Rufus to make a copy of my Steam Deck SSD that I can reuse in the future. This is simple, but you do have to have enough free storage to hold an image of your drive. After that's done, we can insert the drive that we want flash, and Rufus will take care of everything for us. If you're doing this with a bigger drive like I am, this entire process can take a bit of time to complete, but it should work. Well, it took longer than I thought it would, but we're finally done. Now we can go ahead and assemble this again. All right, I'm going to stop just short of putting on the back shell because I want to address a topic that I haven't talked about yet, and that is compatibility with third-party shells. I got shells from two different companies for this, and then hopefully give you some idea of what you can expect. So the first one is this JSOC's back plate. This one has a big piece of metal right here that is supposed to have a conductive rubber pad on the back, but I removed that when I used this on my normal Steam Deck. This one fits no problem on this, but I would need to do a lot more testing to find out how this impacts the thermals of this, because this is not the same platform as the original device. We also have another type of shell that doesn't try to do anything different. It's just like an OEM replacement. This one is from Extreme Rate. It doesn't have that metal plate here, and this one also fits perfectly on the deck. I think JSOC's also makes a case like this that doesn't have that metal plate here. Between the two styles, I think this is the safer bet with this updated platform. However, not all shells will work. This is the RGB backplate that JSOX also makes, and it has a battery module right here in the corner that conflicts with these components over here on the top. You could still use this without the RGB functionality if you wanted by removing that PCB, but that kind of defeats the purpose. And that just leaves us with front shell mods, and from everything that I can see here, those should still work. All of the mounting holes are in the same position, but I think some of the inserts for the torque screws would be a bit challenging, so I expect that we'll see a revision of these shells in the near future. I also think it's highly likely that one of these companies is going to come out with a clone of the limited edition OLED model. That being said, I don't think I would do this mod on an OLED deck. As you probably know, I did that shell mod with this atomic purple one, but that was with the cheapest Steam Deck from the original lineup, and I don't know that I would do that again with my own money on a $550 Steam Deck or a $650 Steam Deck. That's just too risky. I was rocking this atomic purple shell for a while, and I only just recently switched it over to this all white shell that I think looks amazing. If I was going to do a shell swap on an OLED deck, it would probably just be to this white shell. Anyway, here's the moment of truth. And I gotta say, after spending all that time doing the drive cloning, I'm very happy to see that this worked without issue. If we go into the settings now and then down to the OS version, you can see that I'm on 3.5.6 because this is the version that was on the Gundam Steam Deck that I cloned. And just to make it a bit easier to distinguish which deck we're looking at any given time, from this point forward, this glossy OLED deck will have these slipcovers on. Now that we have this all set, we are almost ready to do some meaningful tests on this new OLED Steam Deck. But we have to take care of something important first. If you weren't aware, people discovered that there are two suppliers for the OLED screen in the new OLED Steam Deck by looking over the code. One of them is from Samsung, and the other is from a company called BOE. Before we move forward, it is important that we find out which panel we have in both devices so that we don't classify one screen as being better just because it comes from a better supplier. I also want to follow that up by benchmarking the new display so we can properly compare it to the top end one. For the first part, we're going to switch over to the computer, and I'll show you how to do this on your own Steam Deck if you want to know what panel you have. On your OLED deck, head over to desktop mode, open console, and enter this command. If you end up seeing 0330 in the first line where I'm highlighting right now, you have a Samsung OLED panel. To my knowledge, no one has reported having a BOE panel yet, but if you did have one, it would say 0430. We can know with full certainty that we have a Samsung panel by decoding the EDID so we can see the timings. The Samsung panel and the BOE panel have different timings, and these are the timings that Valve published online for the Samsung panel. After running that same command on my other Steam Deck, I found that it also has a Samsung panel. Now it's time to benchmark our new screen so we have concrete data to work with. In the interest of getting an apples to apples comparison, I redid my original benchmark on my 1TB OLED deck, also running on 3.5.6. When it comes to the glossy OLED deck, we have 100% of the sRGB color space, and we slightly exceed the rated 600 nits of peak brightness for this panel with a measurement of 601 nits. For the P3 color space, we have 90.2% coverage. When it comes to the 1TB OLED deck with etched glass, we essentially have 100% sRGB coverage, but our max brightness is just a bit lower at 588 nits. This difference is very small, and it wasn't something that I could notice before doing this test. For the P3 color space, we scored slightly higher than the other OLED deck at 90.7%. I also measured the color temperature of both screens, and I got almost the same value. So at least based on the data that we don't have a clear winner. The 1TB screen has a wider gamut, but it is well within a margin of error for a component like this. We will look at these screens in a few different settings for this video, but the takeaway from these tests is that in at least one of those settings, there should be no visible difference between these panels. Now that we've benchmarked both of these Steam Decks and we know what display they're using, it's time to take a look at how they operate in different settings. This is going to be the biggest part of this video. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can use a Steam Deck, and there are a lot of different settings that you can play a Steam Deck in. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to boil this down to 3 tests that are the most common for my use case. The first one is indoors with lights on. The second one is indoors at night with no lights on. And the third one is outside on a cloudy day or in the shade. We're going to start off with the easiest scenario to look at, and it's the one that I find myself in the most with my Steam Deck. As I've talked about in a lot of other videos, I do most of my gaming at night, and that's primarily when I'm using my Steam Deck the most. Currently, I'm playing through a ton of retro emulation on this bottom Steam Deck here after I did that emulation video, and in those situations, there shouldn't be a difference between these screens at all because we're seeing them in the same way that the measuring tool does. But nevertheless, we'll still take a look at it. So for this, we're gonna have to shut off the studio lights to simulate playing this at night. And again, this is how I use my Steam Deck the most. We're going to take a look at two games for this section. The first one is Stray, and I have it loaded into the same save state on both of these decks, and to my eyes, I can't see a difference between the two of these. Keep in mind that the Steam Deck on top is the one with a higher brightness, but the one on the bottom, which is the 1TB model, has a wider color gamut. The small differences that we do have in the actual display are just too small that you would never be able to see them in a situation like this. But we can just do a small test of the viewing angles to make sure that that didn't change. So this is the 512 OLED, and this is front, back, right side, left side, and then the 4 diagonals. And here's that same situation on the 1TB model. Front, back, right, left, and then the diagonals. As you can probably imagine, they look the same. And the second title that we're going to look at is Metroid for the NES. Again, these look very similar, but I'll still show it for the purposes of this video. Here's the 512 unit. And here's the 1TB. If you have an OLED deck, this is a great game to play through. Highly recommend it. Now let's move over to the next scenario. Our next scenario is using the Steam Deck indoors with lighting. And this is the second most common way that I'll use my own Steam Deck. In the situation I'm in right now, I have controlled lighting. There is a big light in front of me, and if we just leave the Steam Decks down on a table like this, they should still look the same, with the only difference being that there might be some parts of one Steam Deck that aren't as in focus as the other. What we need to do is see how the panels interact with a lighting source to see how that impacts the display itself. And we're going to start with Metroid since it has a lot of black on the screen. If you're completely new to the Steam Deck, then I think we can start by going over what it is that the etched glass even does in the first place. If I take my Steam Deck and I lift it back like this, the light source reflection starts over here on the top, and then it will diffuse across the entire screen. So this part right here has the brightest reflection, and then it starts to diffuse out as we get down to the bottom, and when it gets all the way to the bottom, it's basically still pitch black. And you can see if we push this back even more, we can cover the entire screen so it's reflecting the full light source, but it's diffused across the entire screen and it's not that harsh. If we do that same thing now again with a glossy screen, you'll see that that initial reflection is very harsh, but then if you just go just a bit under it, the rest of the screen is very mute. If we tilt it back so that way we are reflecting the entire light source, this is how it looks. If you've read any discussion on this new etched glass OLED model, then you'll know that there's a lot of talk about how this etched glass will ruin the vibrancy of the colors that we're getting because it's getting in the way. If we look at this area right here on both screens, I can say that that part looks better on the glossy screen than it does on the etched glass screen. At least with the way that the camera is in focus right now, this top part looks about the same on both models, but if we were actually to focus on that glass like your eyes would be if you were playing this game, the situation is a bit different. So there are pros and cons to both of these screens. The problem with the glossy screen is when you do focus on those reflections, they're very clear and they can be distracting, whereas on the etched glass version, that doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen to that extent. Basically, in almost any test that we do where we're looking at a light just bouncing directly at the screen, you'll have a better experience with the etched glass OLED screen than you will on the glossy one. If you see here, we have the light source shining over onto this pillar and it diffuses out to about this point. Even with this light pointed directly at the screen, I can still see everything on the screen itself. If we put that same light over on the glossy screen, I can still see the same elements, but it doesn't look as good to me. But what about the etched glass taking away from the goodness of this OLED screen? And there's only one situation where the etched glass pulls ahead in my opinion. In all of the testing that I did, if you go to an area of the screen where the etched glass would diffuse, those elements look much better on the glossy screen. The diffusion that we have here does have an impact on the picture quality in that area, but it's not that big of a deal. More than anything else, I think in situations like this, it matters a lot more how much light you have on your face, because that is going to reflect very clearly on a big glossy screen. For example, here's my hand reflected onto the screen. You can see my hand, but it's not that clear. And if we do that same thing on the glossy screen, you can see it's super distracting. And this has been my experience with the original deck. But we have one final scenario to take a look at, which is gaming outdoors. For the last test, I took both decks out to the park and I sat in the shade under a tree. With 600 nits of peak brightness for SDR content, we have more than enough power to make this a viable option outdoors. On the 1TB OLED deck, we can still see some reflections in the tree that's behind me, but the game is still playable. When we switch over to the 512 deck, the game is still playable, but is way more distracting since the screen can reflect the universe. Even though this version looks better in the studio setting when we have controlled lighting, I think it loses that benefit when you have all kinds of random colors reflecting all over the scene. And those are brighter games. It gets worse when we play something that is darker because the screen will turn into a mirror. The etched glass deck just holds up way better in this situation. After going through all of this, I have a few takeaways and suggestions that might help you if you're unsure of which model to buy. The first thing is that the etched glass did not have as big of an impact on the OLED panel as I was led to believe from the comments that I read online. From some of the posts that were made, you'd swear the etched glass would turn the screen into trash, but I'm not seeing that. The second takeaway has to do with the setting that you play in. If you do most of your gaming in the dark at night, there is no difference between either of these, so it doesn't matter which option you go with. Lastly, no matter which option you go with, Samsung seems to have done a great job at providing a consistent screen for this first batch of panels. We don't know how that will hold up going forward, or if the BOE panels can match this quality, but this is a good initial impression. If you still don't know which option you should buy, here's my advice. Buy the model that you have enough money to afford. If you can only afford the cheaper OLED version, just buy it. You can always get an etched glass screen protector to put over it in the future. You can also upgrade the storage to 1TB if you ever need to. On the flip side of this, you can also use a glossy screen protector on an etched glass screen to make it look like a standard panel. I did this with my original 512 deck, and I think it looks great. After spending so much time with an etched glass screen on my original deck, I like how this panel looks with this protector installed. More than anything else, the other parts of this package are more important to consider. These would be the charging case, better protective case with an inner shell, and the increased storage. That being said, I think the etched glass screen holds up better than the glossy one, especially in uncontrolled lighting situations. I hope that helps. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see another, take a look at a big emulation video that I did on the OLED Steam Deck. Happy gaming everyone, Taki out.